Was John the Baptist bigger than Jesus, or am I confusing him with John Lennon? Hello and welcome back. This is Living the Life, the Ministry Years, session 1.00. And we're going to be introducing the character of John the Baptist, who of course is the forerunner of Jesus and is the person who launches Jesus' career. And as we're going to see, actually what we know of John's ministry interlocks and kind of spaces out Jesus' ministry as well. So let's make a start. So I always remember some years back, it's probably around Easter a time, where the BBC kind of makes a documentary about Jesus, you know. They did one, and the kind of the way they were presenting it, they were kind of presenting as if there was almost a conspiracy theory that the early church had suppressed the significance of the ministry of John, because actually, if you really want to know the truth, John was really important and possibly even bigger than Jesus. And I remember I was watching it and I was thinking, the trouble is, you see, is they make these statements. But if you study these things, you know the truth is John is far more significant than most people realise. And that doesn't come out particularly in the Gospels, not because of any conspiracy theory, but because the Gospels are really being written for a community that is growing forwards. They're about discipleship and introducing the significance of Jesus, whereas John, in one sense, is the baton hander from the old to the new. And so his role is not suppressed, but it's not kind of unpacked as fully as it could be, because we'll see as we kind of go on in this session, Josephus says he could have commanded an army because he is so significant. But actually the New Testament writers aren't so concerned with that. But what I want to do in this session is just kind of present to you the sort of size and shape and significance of John's ministry. And so it is worth noting, we looked when we were fitting the Gospels together, there are only a handful of events that appear in all four Gospels, outside of the final week and the crucifixion and resurrection. If you take those bits out, feeding of the 5,000 is in all of the Gospels. Jesus' move to the south, down into Judea, is mentioned in all four Gospels. But actually, of course, Jesus' baptism is in all four Gospels when that happens under John. But equally, the role of John as the forerunner also appears in all four Gospels. And not only that, obviously in John's Gospel and in Mark's Gospel, which don't include kind of birth narratives, John is the beginning of the Gospels. So alongside this session, as well as your notes, you'll also find there's a file which is a kind of a translation file for a Jesus-centered version. It's not the text from Jesus' ministry years, because we've just not quite got onto that yet, but it's a nice way of introducing how that text will work. Because if you kind of print it out, you'll find it's color coded, because we color code each word from different Gospels. It's quite simple, because with John and with Mark, who kind of introduced John as foundational at the beginnings, the way they open their Gospels. You can see, so one verse from Mark there in blue, and then followed by some verses from John, and then some more verses from Mark in blue, and some more from John. But it's just really interesting. I'm going to use Mark's Gospel to kind of introduce the way in which John is introduced. And then from that, we'll just kind of actually look at the shape of his ministry and the way it integrates and fits with Jesus, and how things that happen to John actually mark key changes in the way Jesus does things. So Mark's Gospel starts, and he starts by saying, this is the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And that's where we put verse 1. But verse 1 wasn't put in by Mark, it's been put in by us. I tend to think that probably it should run a little bit longer. It should be the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as was written by the prophet Isaiah. It's kind of, if you like, the opening statement, the kind of almost title statement of the Gospel. And Mark is the first writer to take the word gospel, which is the message they're preaching, and apply it to the narrative of Jesus. So we use it now for all of them, but Matthew never calls his gospel a gospel. He tells it the story of Jesus. Mark applies the word to the story of Jesus, and that's how we use it today. But I like Mark's opening, along with so much in his Gospels. It's really punchy. You can see it, and I've got some teaching on the way each of the Gospels starts, which you may want to kind of look at in your own time. And each of them, in many ways, you can kind of see the character of the writer reflected in the way they open things up. And so Mark kind of goes piling in there. It makes it really kind of quick and punchy. So I won't read you what John the Gospel writer wrote about John the Baptist. You can do that in your own time, and see how the two kind of fit together, because we've integrated them both together in the notes as you download them. But I will read the opening few verses of Mark because they're so quick and punchy. So the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as is written in Isaiah the prophet. Now, some of your translations will miss out the word Isaiah the prophet, because Mark then doesn't quote from Isaiah, he quotes from Malachi, and they think that he made a mistake. And so they follow some later manuscripts that have also, for the same reason, dropped the word Isaiah. So it just says, as it says in the prophets. But it's probably missing, in one sense, it's obscuring, if you like, the Jewishness of Mark as a writer. It's one of these things where you see a Hebraism or an Aramaism. You see something very, very Semitic, as opposed to Greek. Because if you were a Greek, you would quote instantly the person you just cited. But actually, in the rabbinic writings, we often find a very similar kind of form to what we find here in Mark. Which is that Mark says, as was written by Isaiah the prophet, because Isaiah is where we get the real meat and the real detail from, and then he kind of quotes from somewhere else, and he quotes from somewhere else, and he kind of builds them together to create a crescendo before he quotes Isaiah. And so one of those things he draws from is from Exodus. Actually, I'll put the... Yeah, so it's it's Exodus 23. Let's go. He quotes from Exodus 23, verse 20. And he blends that. It's kind of the statement is a blend of Exodus and Malachi, which is fascinating. So he's gone right to the beginning of Judaism as the world's first monotheistic religion. So what about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before then? Yeah, before the Exodus, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob worshipped God, but it was more what is technically called henotheism. They saw their God as more important. Maybe he was the creator, but they didn't have a full kind of working functional religion around that. It was a personal experience. Exodus gives birth to monotheism as a cultural phenomena, and it gives birth to the writing of the Old Testament. So it's the beginning really of Jewish history. And then the other end, Malachi, is the very last prophetic voice in the Old Testament. The very last words are probably the words of Nehemiah in his prayer at the end of that book. But Malachi is the last prophetic voice, and so the words are particular. So as it goes on, he says, as is written Isaiah the prophet, and then this blended phrase that comes from Exodus and Malachi, see, I send my messenger before your face, who will fully prepare your road. So Exodus 23:20 reads, see, same, I am sending an angel. Well, the word angel is just messenger. A messenger. A manger. So that's a birth narrative. See, I'm sending, so it's not my, but it's I'm sending a messenger before you to guard you and to guard you on the way and bring you to the place I prepared. So the Exodus context, as the nation is being birthed, is going to be led into the promised land. There's been a messenger that has gone with it, and starts with the word see, so it kind of looks like that. Whereas Malachi doesn't use the word see, so he just says now, but then he goes back and says, I'm sending my messenger. Well, which messenger? Well, probably just like the messenger that was back there in Exodus, you see. Sending my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come into his temple. And so Malachi is kind of going back. We've got that messenger. Remember that messenger? And he's coming, and he's going to lead us somewhere. But the reason he does that, you see, if you kind of read on in Malachi, you see Malachi has an assumed context. And his assumed context is the prophet Isaiah. It references back to Exodus right at the beginning, but Isaiah has unpacked it in a little more detail. So Malachi is the very last prophetic voice of the Old Testament, is saying, don't forget my messenger who's coming. And just like in the past, where my messenger led you through the wilderness and took us through the kind of the days of the first covenant and into the promised land, he's coming again, and the Lord will come suddenly. And so Malachi goes on, the messenger of the covenant whom you desire to see, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. So it's almost the last promise, the last prophetic promise, is my messenger who leads you through covenant into promised land is coming. And actually Malachi also talks about his role in preparing a sacrifice and so on. But the context of this one who's coming, we find in the book of Isaiah. Now, I won't do that right now, because we'll actually do it in the next couple of episodes. So for now, I just wanted to kind of flag there's no mistake in the way Mark says it. He's producing this kind of crescendo. It's like a fanfare, and then quotes from Isaiah. But he clearly presents, and you find it similarly in the way John presents it, that John says he came, he wasn't the light, but he made everybody see and understand the light. And so if you look at what John writes, it kind of gives sense to those words that Paul speaks in Galatians, where he says the law is a tutor that leads us to Christ. Because according to Mark, if you like, according to Mark, the Old Testament, both from beginning to end, is anticipating a kind of replacement covenant that's coming, and where we'll see somehow again the messenger coming, God's messenger who comes and leads them, and is the kind of therefore the fulfillment of both beginning and end, and unpacked in Isaiah. He's going to come and he's going to make a way for the Lord to come, and the Lord's then going to come into his temple, and that kind of a reference was understood by the rabbis to mean we're now stepping into the last days, the messianic age, all of those sorts of things. And here is John, because he then finishes Mark's first words. John the gospel writer then finishes, and that person's John. That's who he is. And that's actually the role that kind of John plays to Jesus. We'll see it's more significant than simply baptism. It's got kind of key points in it. So I'll just kind of lay out the framework of that in this session to see how they fit, but to kind of get a sense of the significance and importance of John the Baptist. So John, of course, we pick up from the birth narratives, is related to Jesus, but we don't know anything about their interconnections before. Obviously, John the Baptist's parents were quite old when he was born, and John, it seems, has had some sort of influence from the Essenes down in Qumran. He comes up, it's interesting that if you look at the different Gospels, he comes up out of the wilderness and into the wilderness. So how can you come out of the wilderness and come into the wilderness? Well, when you see the Qumran community, which we think is an Essene community, there was one there on the Dead Sea we're told about. You can both come out of that community and you can kind of go onto the land where, if you like, the wilderness kind of blends now into more civilized society. So are you coming out of the wilderness, or is it that people are kind of seeing you in what they think of as the wilderness, in that kind of fringe aspect? So you can see how he does that. He comes out of that context into the wilderness, and he comes with a message. And it's really significant because we meet that message right the way through the New Testament. Obviously, we're going to see him interacting with Jesus, but we get into the book of Acts, and we read about a man called Apollos, who's I think is he in Corinth? He meets in Corinthians. He meets Priscilla and Aquila, and he's a disciple of John the Baptist. And then we read in Ephesus, and it says that Apollos wasn't there. The reason it says Apollos wasn't there because he would have been a good person. While Apollos was in Corinth, Paul turns up, and there's some more disciples of John the Baptist, but they're in Ephesus. And so Paul kind of teaches and leads them. And then interestingly, when Paul writes the letter to the Ephesians, he actually uses a number of phrases which we find kind of in the Qumran text down by the Dead Sea. So you can sort of see a connection. If the Qumran is Essene and John was somehow influenced or perhaps even brought up by the Essenes, because after his parents have died, maybe he's gone into that community. Certainly Josephus, the historian, tells us that there were around 6,000 priests. Not all of them, therefore, were full-time at the temple, and John's parents would be some of those. But an awful lot of those priests we pick up, I don't think it's in Josephus, I think it's in somebody else who tells us, link up because they're not really that integrated with the temple, with the Essene movement, and become priests within that, and they're the ones who tend to be celibate. And as far as we know, John the Baptist isn't married, so he looks like he's perhaps one of those, which is really interesting because we're going to see that if you put the different references to the relationship between Jesus and John, they seem to be closer than you would just get from an instant if Jesus had just turned up one day, been baptized by him, been testified to, and so on, and moved on. And I'm going to present a case, which you don't have to share, but I'm sure is the case, that actually Jesus' relationship with John goes back quite a long way. It's much more deep, and that Jesus, actually from the beginning of the days of John's ministry, is actually working with him as a sort of as a sub person. So how do you get that? Well, there's that moment where John's disciples, they're referred to, John's disciples say, Do you remember that person who was with you? And so by saying, the way they say it, was with you, not was with us, but was with you, they are recognizing that Jesus' status under John's ministry was higher than theirs. And that's possible if they understood, if Jesus has gone down in the early days, maybe even before John has gone public, because he would have had a private period of rabbinic ministry where he's just learning to teach and getting his messages shaped before he comes out of the wilderness and starts to preach publicly to the crowds. Maybe Jesus is even connected with him in those days. Certainly Jesus hasn't got married, which is, if he's seen as having some sort of influence within the Qumran community, maybe they would understand things in those ways. But within that context, John clearly, by his own testimony, hasn't recognized Jesus as the one he is the forerunner for. Say, well, how could he not? Surely he would know, because we read the story of Jesus' birth and Mary's birth. But that account has almost undoubtedly come from Mary herself. Luke, who gives us the account, we knows Jesus' brother James. We can tell that from the book of Acts because of the way, when he's with Paul, it says, we took Paul in to meet James. So the implication is that Luke knows James better than Paul does. And they're there for a couple of years, and James, of course, is Jesus' brother, and that's an ideal opportunity for Luke, therefore, to pick up the familial stories, and perhaps directly from Mary. And so you can understand very easily how it's slightly distant cousins, and Mary's come down to Elizabeth, and before John is born, and there's a prophetic word which is about him being a forerunner, but she's disappeared at that stage, and actually her pregnancy is something that's been hidden and kept secret. So not everybody in that orbit would necessarily know. It'd be very easy for the story to be kind of lost in detail, remembered by Mary, who stored up these things, as Luke tells us, then passed on to Luke, but only to be vaguely aware of it if you're John the Baptist. And so John says, well, I didn't recognize him, but the implication of that is I've known him for a while. It wasn't that he just turned up and I didn't get it. It's in all the time I've known him, I didn't realize he would be the one that my ministry was preparing the way for. I may have had those prophecies about being a forerunner, and it shapes the style of John's message, but I didn't get it until I baptized him. Now, when John baptizes Jesus, again, we see something of the history between them, because he says, I shouldn't be baptized. You don't need to be baptized. Well, you don't need to be baptized means that somehow John understands that Jesus' heart is really clean and before the Lord already. And then he says, and you should baptize me. But Jesus says, no, to fulfill all righteousness. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, actually, part of the prophecy in Malachi of the messenger is the messenger who comes before is a priest who prepares what's coming. It doesn't quite explicitly say, I think, prepares the sacrifice, but there is a sense in which actually it is John's role to prepare Jesus. And that's the kind of part of the prophecy of Malachi. So Jesus is wanting to serve and actually go through all of the right motions and present himself for baptism and for the washing of the body, which John, as we'll see through Josephus, John's message is actually, it's only a kind of a symbol, it's an outward symbol, it's not the thing that actually makes you clean. But you see that the kind of the context of that implies more of the relational mix. Then of course, I say then of course, so yes, you're kind of getting a feel. I don't want these to go on for hours and hours, so I have to kind of select what we put in. What I would flag is this isn't just my view. It's not uncommon to find serious biblical scholars who understand that actually Jesus kind of almost grew and developed and shaped himself. It's interesting if you under John the Baptist ministry, it's interesting Jesus's first public sermon, "Repent, the kingdom of heaven is hand," is borrowed verbatim pretty much from what we read about John the Baptist preaching. And anyone who has ever been a public preacher, like I have done, knows you borrow your sermons from those who've trained you to start with. All your best anecdotes and your best lines you've borrowed from those that you've sat under. As you go on, you develop your own, and actually we see that pattern between Jesus and John. What was I going to? There was something else I was going to say. Oh yes, that's right. We were just saying. So for instance, in terms of scholars that recognise the kind of the strength of this connection, there are people like E.P. Saunders, who was for years is kind of considered to be the authority on the Apostle Paul. It's sort of displaced now by N.T. Wright or Tom Wright. But he takes that view as a very close developmental relationship between John and Jesus. J.G. Dunn, James Dunn, again, who I know shares a similar view on the early dates of the gospel writing to me. He takes the same view. So there are various people like that. So it's not that unusual. I'm just kind of presenting it. It's not key that you fully accept it, but it to me it becomes a very good explanatory mechanism when we see some of their interactions, and we'll look at those in more detail as we come to them verse by verse. Just final thing perhaps on this bit before we then finish by just looking at what Josephus tells us to see how significant John's ministry was, is one of the things that's been noticed in that context, which we can't say 100%, but looks to me to be sensible, is that one of the things that marks out the difference between John's ministry and Jesus's is that John did all the baptizing. So you were actually baptized by John, whereas of course with Jesus it's his disciples that baptize. And so obviously the reason why that's been picked out historically by folks is that therefore John the Baptist's death is the death of the movement, because he is the key figure at the beginning of it, whereas Jesus' ministry, we start to get something qualitatively different about it, which sometimes we don't get that picture when we're just reading back the Gospels and we don't stop and think through them, which is his ministry was always about giving away and equipping others to do what he did and greater works too. And so right from the beginning, actually, we find it saying of Jesus, it wasn't Jesus doing it, it was his disciples right from the very beginning. And just on that comment, that happens in a context where John the Baptist has deliberately vacated what is the ideal spot for his ministry. It's close to home, as we're going to see. It's right on the border of the wilderness, at the base of the Jordan, and it's right on the key kind of pilgrim routes as people come into Jerusalem. Anyone coming from the west or from the north are going to come through that location. If you come up from, say, Alexandria, then you may easy to pop out there. It's not that far across. It's the prime location for baptisms, and yet at the key moment when all of the pilgrims are coming through, John the Baptist vacates it, where he's been for ages, and leaves it for Jesus. And I can't help but seeing something coordinated there, not accidental, that John deliberately leaves it free so that Jesus can actually step into. So it's almost like John is deliberately making space, and it's in that context where John says of that moment that he must increase, I must decrease, he must increase. It's almost as though John is actually, he's giving words to what he's actually doing by shifting his ministry up to a less salubrious spot, but to give Jesus more space. And then we see how John's kind of, the events that happen to John as things go on actually become kind of key markers and transitions in Jesus' ministry. So Jesus has been under John for a period, culminating in baptism by John, and then John has started to point people to Jesus. And we know from the book of Acts that Jesus meets under the ministry of John the Baptist all of his disciples. So it says that they could only appoint another apostle from those who've been with them from the beginning, from the days of John the Baptist, i.e. the implication is from the days where they all met under that ministry. So we only read about a few of them in John's Gospel, but that doesn't mean to say that Jesus hasn't met them before. And so that's the kind of initial context. As I say, John then chooses to move to a less salubrious location, leaving at Passover time, and between Passover and Pentecost, where Jesus now has the prime location at Bethabara, down in the south near the Jordan. There's a fording point. Jesus is baptizing there, and this perfect location ends up baptizing more people because John's made space for him. And then Jesus starts heading up towards Galilee through Samaria. It's during that period that it seems that John is arrested. And so as Jesus comes into Galilee, John has now been arrested. And initially, Jesus just starts kind of, if you like, going as kind of an invited rabbi speaker to various synagogues before he relocates from Nazareth to Capernaum and then starts a tour around Galilee. And at that point, he goes back to some of those that he's already met: Matthew, Peter, James, John, Andrew, and says when he calls them to follow him, not as disciples, they've already been in that place, but actually to go on tour, which is a brand new style of doing ministry. John didn't used to do that. John used to go to a place and people would come to him. Jesus actually takes the message out with his disciples. That's why he has to call them. And that has been, if you like, that moment is released by John's arrest, because John is now, it's kind of almost like Jesus has honoured that space by not doing things so publicly, just developing in private. Now that John has been arrested, Jesus takes the message on the road, and that's what we kind of, as we're doing this, we're going to call the growth period. So he's gone through kind of development and preparation. He's now into growth mode. And towards the end of that growth period, John is executed. And actually, in response, is at the point where the disciples are out ministering ahead of Jesus. So he's sent out the 12 at that point. It seems to be during that ministry phase that John is executed. And as a result, Jesus then feeds 5,000 among other things. And we suddenly step into this multiplication phase. So just as the arrest kind of releases growth, before as preparation with John kind of in relationship to Jesus, then we're stepping into kind of growth. There's a little bit of interaction, of course, during that period as that growth is happening, and with the execution of John, suddenly the multiplication happens. And so you see how the events that are happening to John are shaping the ministry that Jesus has. So we'll just finish this session. I just thought it'd be worth seeing the kind of the secular record from Josephus of John the Baptist, and which technically has more text to it than what he writes about Jesus, which is one of the big things that the BBC commentary likes to make as if it's some sort of conspiracy that was being hidden by the church. It's not. But it highlights, in one sense, how significant John's ministry was. It's possible, I won't do it now, that Luke, the gospel writer, who's Lucius of Cyrene, who of course tells us the story about John the Baptist's John the Baptist's birth, as he's got that story from Jesus' brother James via his mother probably. But it's possible that Luke was a follower of John the Baptist, and John the gospel writer, if he is John the elder and is actually based, as is one theory, he's actually a priest. Down in Judea, he may well have been part of that community too, and which is why perhaps he draws out some more of the kind of details of what John said to Jesus and so on. I think there's another solution, but I'm just highlighting that as a possibility. Yes, that's right. It just wanted to get across. So Josephus actually shows, and we'll see how significant John's ministry is. So I can't remember all of what Josephus said, so I printed out some bits. But it's in the context which actually helps. It also touches on the timing and chronology, and that's key to us putting this harmony together. So the reason it is because some people have read Josephus quite quickly, and we'll highlight why it's not the case, and said, oh look, John is executed just before Herod has a battle with Aretas, who's another king, and their armies kill each other, and that doesn't happen till 36 AD. So the Gospels must be wrong, because the Gospels say that Jesus is executed, and it looks like it's 30 or 33 AD. Can't be as late as 36. That's impossible because of other things that have happened historically at this stage. Therefore, the Gospels must be wrong, which is just stupid, just being really blunt, and also is very casual reading, because as we'll see, he doesn't actually say and one happens then the other. He says one happens and actually then there's a period of time and then the other happens. So, but we'll see. You'll see what I mean. So he tells the story. So this is Josephus telling John the Baptist's story, and he puts it in the context of the humiliation of Herod Antipas. So he sees the arrest and execution of John the Baptist as being key and tied together with the humiliation of Herod at the hands of Aretas, the king of Petra. Pardon me. So about this time, Aretas, the king of the Arabian city Petra, and Herod Antipas had a quarrel, you see. So Herod the Tetrarch had married the daughter of Aretas. Her name is Phasaelis, but he doesn't say that here. And he'd lived with her a great while. But when he was once at Rome, he lodged with Herod. This is his half-brother, Philip, or Herod Philip, as we sometimes refer to him. And he basically, I won't read it all. Josephus tells us the story. Just out of interest, actually, if you're interested, you can pick up things like this. This is an abridged version of the writings of Josephus. I picked it up for a couple of pounds in a second-hand bookshop. I now wish I had a full copy, just because I've done more. But it's really worth reading. You get lots of background to Old Testament stories. You get the wisdom of what the Jews thought about certain situations and so on. So they're always worth picking up if you can find one. And that's where I've got some of this text from. So anyway, what happens is he falls in love with Herod, Philip's wife, and he kind of negotiates with him and agrees that she'll divorce Herod and then he'll come back with him to Galilee as his wife, his new wife. But in the meantime, while he's negotiating that in Rome, somehow the word gets back to the daughter of Aretas, and she finds out what's happening and realizes it could be bad for her. It's not impossible for Herod Antipas to have multiple wives, but one of them will definitely be a second-class one, and she will be humiliated. And she kind of takes action, and so she sends some resources down to the south to Machaerus, where eventually John the Baptist is going to be arrested, and that's where he'll be when he's executed. And then as she sends a message to her husband and says, do you mind if I kind of zip down to the south, better scenery or something? And he says, yes, that's fine. She goes down there, gets all her stuff and zips back home to her father. So she never actually has to face, if you like, and be humiliated by the new wife. And that's the cause of the quarrel, you see. And so Josephus says, so Aretas made this the first occasion of the enmity between him and Herod. And he also had some quarrel with him about their limits, or about their borders and boundaries, where one joins the other, you see, near Gamala. And so both sides raised armies, prepared for war, and sent their generals to fight. And that's what happens in 36 AD. But if you notice carefully, what Josephus has said is that this was the first occasion. This is the cause of tension, was the divorcing of his wife. He doesn't say they divorced, caused tension, and they had a battle. He said this was the first. And then when the border dispute turned up, which they're probably both a bit sensitive about now because of the breakdown of relationship, that becomes the cause of the battle. So there's no conflict or contradiction between the Gospels and Josephus here. So then it says, when they joined battle, Herod's army was completely destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives who were sent from the Tetrarchy of Philip and had joined Aretas' army. So anyway, he goes on and then says, now, this is where it gets interesting, because we now find a bit more about John the Baptist's ministry. He says, so now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God as a just punishment for what Herod had done against John, who was called the Baptist. So there were a big chunk of Judaism that saw what happened to John the Baptist and saw that as divine, the loss of Herod's army as divine punishment for it. And for Herod had killed this good man who had commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, righteousness towards each other, and piety towards God. For only thus, in John's opinion, would the baptism he administered be acceptable to God. So he wasn't giving them a baptism, if you like, that made them clean. He was saying, because you're changing, this then becomes, if you like, the fruit of that. And there's nothing contradictory in the fact that the New Testament, the reason I mention this is some people say there is, says that John came preaching a baptism for repentance. He wasn't saying you get baptized and that's how you repent. It was a part of a process of change, and so changed behaviour, changed heart, and now you go through the prophetic symbol, if you like. So namely, if they were to obtain not a pardon for their sins, but rather the cleansing of their bodies, as it was taken for granted that their souls had been purified for justice. So they were already going through those things. Now, many people came in crowds to him, for they were greatly moved by his words. And Herod, who feared the great influence John had over the masses, might put them into his power and enable him to raise a rebellion. So he saw John's influence as so significant that he could raise an army to rebel. For they seemed ready to do anything that he, that's John, would advise. So Herod thought it best to put him to death, in this way that he might prevent any mischief John might cause, and not bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent, if that wasn't too late. And so accordingly John was sent as a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I already mentioned, and he was put to death. Now the Jews thought the destruction of his army was sent as punishment on Herod, and the mark of God's displeasure with him. And so really, just as we kind of draw this session to a close, what you can see is that the significant implication of John was such a key figure that he's understood from a socio-political kind of point of view of having real influence enough to be able to raise a rebellious army against Herod. And it's also interesting that in this context, it seems that the Jews are kind of more comfortable with the message of John than perhaps in retrospect, those who haven't become Christians later are with the message of Jesus. And what's just interesting is there is still a community left to this day. I'm just can't remember what they've got. The Mandeans. And there's about 60 to 70,000 of them now. They used to live in Iraq, but they got spread during the Iraq War. They've got spread all over the world, who actually trace the ancestry of their little religious community right the way back to John. They seem to have had an influence on the Manichees, who was Saint Augustine of Rome got saved out of Manichaeism. And that they have an alphabet. It's Aramaic and is very similar in its letters to first century Judea at the time. So it's kind of really interesting. You've got still this community that you can trace all the way back. And what's really interesting is that for them, John is the ultimate prophet. They actually reject Jesus. So they were, if you like, disciples of John who didn't become Christians. But they reject Moses and Abraham. So how does that happen? How come all those key Jewish people, and they were clearly Jewish originally, but again you can see something of over time a corruption of an Essene agenda here, because the Essenes had rejected the temple, and so you can actually see, if you like, a kind of a dissatisfaction with the Jewish way of doing things, which in time, but they still trace their roots all the way back to John the Baptist. So it's quite remarkable to think that in such a troubled part of the world, that even today there are 60 to 70,000 people, although they're spread all over the world, that can trace their origins back. But interestingly, in their past, the Mandeans used to call themselves the Nazuri. That's it, the Nazuri, which is interesting because we do read, as we touched on the other week, a Jewish sect that many of whom have become Christians called the Nazareans, who are using the Gospel of Matthew still written in Hebrew. So that those two could be the same, and it's not impossible for them to have split at some point. And so, just I suppose drawing all of these things together. John, in his own way, has had a massive, significant impact. He has communities of people all over the ancient world as the gospel goes out, who have already been influenced by his message. And we're going to think about that message a little bit more and the prophetic context to it from Isaiah in the next weeks. He's had that huge impact in Judea itself. He's been so significant in the territory of the Herods, that they've worried that he might raise an army. But in that context, we see a man who seems to have an intimate relationship and understand Jesus, and Jesus who understands John. And one of the things I hadn't said is when Jesus sends a response to John when he's worrying, are you really the Messiah? Jesus is interesting. He actually uses a formula that, though you can match it with passages of Isaiah, actually fits better with the document we find in the Qumran scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls. It's just trying to think what the document's called. We'll do it when we come to it. But actually, it's interesting that as they had summed up their various expectations of the Messiah, they had drawn from various sources and kind of put them into a list. And Jesus' list actually matches that list better than it does Isaiah, which is kind of a nice little touch, because if actually that is part of John's background, and if perhaps Jesus has even had some sort of influence under John even while he's in that, and therefore understands the common understanding that he has of the Messiah from those kind of documents, that Jesus would communicate in those ways. So there are lots of little bits which, if you want to be skeptical, you can dismiss them. But actually, if we try to understand a genuine narrative, look like they're pretty safe ground to say this is a good working assumption. Let's understand this kind of close working and developmental relationship, John to Jesus, in him preparing and what Jesus is going to do, just as he prepares the hearts over here, that he actually gives Jesus some of the purely human skills for public speaking, raising a crowd, gathering people to him, how to do those things. And at a very kind of practical level, he's a kind of part of the shaping of Jesus in those ways. He then kind of deliberately makes space for Jesus. And Jesus has such affection for him that he can say he is there's nobody who is born of the flesh, born of a woman, that is greater than John, although he who's least in the kingdom will be greater than him, because John represents that final voice, that final messenger that was from Exodus to Malachi, expanded by Isaiah, kind of arrives at the transition point to prepare the way for Jesus. And we'll just look at the details of how he does that in the next couple of weeks. So watch out for the next session, and until then, I'll say goodbye.